Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there now. Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. The story is beginning to unfold now. Let's begin. Leif Erikson did not expect to wake up without socks. He certainly hadn't planned to fall asleep in the first place, but the sun had been oddly warm for a northern land. The moss beside the longship had been just the right amount of spongy, and the sound of the waves had been like lullabies hummed by the fjords themselves. So Leif, Viking of Greenland, fierce explorer, son of Eric the Red, had curled up like a sleepy cat and promptly dozed off. When he blinked himself awake, groggy and a bit disoriented, his first thought was, "Where am I?" His second was, "Why are my toes cold?" The toes in question wiggled forlornly at the end of bare feet, his woolen socks gray, slightly mismatched, and deeply beloved were nowhere to be seen. "Bjorn," he muttered, peering around. "Did you steal my socks again?" A shaggy-haired Viking looked up from where he was unsuccessfully trying to toast a pinnacone over a tiny fire. "No," Bjorn said, sounding genuinely hurt. "Not this time," Leif sighed, brushing moss out of his hair. Around him, his crew of adventurers looked less like fierce Norsemen and more like groggy campers on a lazy school trip. Helmets were askew. One man was gently snoring into a bundle of ropes. Another was attempting to turn a birch leaf into a hat. It was not, strictly speaking, a model of efficient exploration, and yet here they were, in a place they had not intended to reach, on a coast that looked only vaguely familiar. The fog rolled in like soup, thick and slightly mysterious, and tall pine trees creaked gently in the distance. "Where are we?" Leif finally asked aloud. No one answered right away. There was some shrugging, a few head scratches. Someone murmured something about accidentally following a very stubborn gull for too long. The shore was unlike anything they had seen in Greenland. There were berries round and shiny and utterly unidentifiable, growing in drooping clusters. Along the tree line, a rabbit hopped slowly past, then paused to give them a very unimpressed look, as if to say, "You again," before continuing at its languid pace. Leif stood up and winced slightly as the cold pebbles nibbled at his feet. "All right," he said, more to the universe than to his crew. "We've apparently discovered something. Are we naming it?" asked Bjorn. "Because I think Sockland has a certain ring to it." Leif gave him a look, but then, after a pause, he tilted his head and muttered, "Sockl and ... whom?" The longship rocked gently in the shallow cove behind them, its carved prow barely visible through the mist. It had been a long journey, longer than intended, really. There had been storms, a detour for an island that turned out to be a very large sleeping whale, and an unfortunate incident involving a barrel of pickled herring and a rebellious seal. Leif wasn't sure if this land was what they'd set out for, but now that they were here, it didn't seem in a hurry to be anything else. He took a tentative step inland, his toes instantly vanishing into thick, springy moss. "Let's go see if my socks are exploring ahead of us," he called. "Form an extremely casual scouting party." The men groaned, stretched, and shuffled after him. No one walked particularly quickly. One stopped to gently pat a tree. Another, for reasons unknown, began humming the theme to a local drinking song in an unusually dramatic whisper. The deeper they went, the stranger things seemed not in a frightening way, but in a dreamy, slightly whimsical one. The trees weren't especially tall, but they seemed to lean toward the men, as if listening. The moss underfoot muffled every step. Even the birds seemed to chirp in slow motion. After a while, Leaf called a break. Not because they were tired, though most of them were always at least mildly tired, but because he had found a curious stump covered in tiny, white mushrooms shaped suspiciously like miniature helmets. Bjorn flopped down beside him. "You ever think," he said slowly, "that maybe we didn't discover anything? Maybe we just ... wandered into someone else's dream?" Leaf considered this. "I mean, we followed a gull for 3 days. Anything's possible." A third Viking, Olaf, suddenly pointed into the mist. "I swear I just saw a sock." Everyone froze. "A sock?" Leaf asked. "Describe it." "Gray, slightly fuzzy, moving that way." He pointed toward a deeper patch of trees. Leaf stood up again, his curiosity suddenly rekindled. "After it, men, we follow the sock." The others rose with varying degrees of enthusiasm. They were explorers, after all, even if half their explorations led directly to naps or snack breaks. And so, with only fog ahead and moss behind, the Vikings set off once more, chasing what may or may not have been a wandering wool sock. It was, all things considered, one of their more focused missions so far. The sock had vanished, not in a puff of smoke or a flash of lightning. This wasn't that kind of story. It had simply drifted out of sight, like everything else in this fog-soaked forest. But Leaf, sockless and increasingly invested, wasn't ready to give up. The crew trudged through the underbrush at a pace that could only be described as leisurely, with occasional stops for interesting rocks. Leaf squinted into the distance, every so often thinking he spotted a wisp of wool, only to find it was a curious mushroom or a particularly optimistic pinnacone. "I don't know if I'm cold or just emotionally invested now," Leaf muttered. Bjorn plodded beside him. "I've given up on the sock. I'm hunting for the meaning of life." He picked a berry and sniffed it cautiously. Or possibly lunch. Eventually, they reached a clearing where the fog lifted just enough to reveal a gentle hill, speckled with low-growing shrubs and the occasional sleepy squirrel blinking, like it had just woken up from a 100-year nap. "Shall we set up camp?" Olaf asked, sitting down without waiting for an answer. "My legs are feeling existential." Leaf looked around. There was something oddly welcoming about the place. A cluster of fir trees leaned in as if to offer shelter. The ground was thick, with moss that seemed to hum with warmth. It was the kind of place that seemed to whisper, "You've come far enough for today, haven't you?" "Yes," Leaf said, giving in. "We shall camp, and we shall do it with all the enthusiasm of a reluctant nap." Bjorn promptly fell backwards into the moss, sighing. "I dubbed this spot Slightly Raised Nap Hill." "Noted," Leaf said, pulling out his journal and carefully writing. Day 1, discovered Slightly Raised Nap Hill. No socks yet. Morale, sleepy but curious, as camp slowly assembled in a series of half-hearted actions 10 poles argued with. Logs dragged 3 feet before being turned into benches. A pot balanced precariously on a rock leaf found himself wandering toward a cluster of unfamiliar shrubs. The leaves were glossy, and between them grew small, golden berries. He plucked one and inspected it. "Cloudberries," a voice said behind him. Leaf jumped. It was Ingrid, the ship's healer and unofficial knower of obscure plants. She held a bundle of herbs and was currently balancing a steaming kettle on a stone. "Cloudberries?" he asked. "They only grow in places too lazy to be properly hot or properly cold," she said, plucking one herself. "Good for stew. Better for dreams." Leaf raised an eyebrow. "You can't seriously believe berries affect dreams?" Ingrid gave him a look that said, "You followed a sock into a forest, and you're questioning buried dreams." "Fair point," Leaf muttered. Soon, the camp was surrounded by the scent of a curious stew bubbling with cloudberries, fish, and possibly a handful of pine needles someone mistook for spice. It didn't matter. It smelled warm and weirdly comforting, not dramatically, but more like someone slowly dimmed the world's brightness. The crew gathered around the fire. They passed bowls of stew and shared theories about where they were. "I think we went through a fog curtain," Bjorn said, "like a portal, but damp." "Maybe this land wasn't supposed to be found," Olaf added, "and that's why it's hiding things, like socks." "I think," said Ingrid, "we're in a story that hasn't decided what it is yet." That quieted them. The fire crackled gently. Moths danced through the haze. Somewhere in the woods, a bird made a noise like a hiccup, and then immediately seemed embarrassed about it. Leaf leaned back, watching the mist above the trees swirl like sleepy clouds. There was a deep contentment settling over him, one that had very little to do with conquest or glory or discovering new lands. It had more to do with the way Bjorn was currently arguing with a squirrel over a spot near the fire, or the soft moss underfoot that made sitting feel like sinking into a friendly sponge, or how someone had managed to fashion a sock puppet out of spare wool and named it Admiral Toadot. There was something beautifully pointless about it all, and leaf-famed explorer, son of wild legends, found he didn't mind one bit. As night fell completely, someone strummed a lyre. Soft notes floated upward, barely louder than the wind. Around the fire, laughter faded into gentle murmurs. Even the trees seemed to exhale. Leaf pulled his cloak around his shoulders, gave Admiral Toe a solemn nod, and whispered, "Tomorrow we find that sock, or at least a better stew recipe." Then he lay back in the moss and let the sounds of sleepy Vikings, slow music, and a burping squirrel lull him toward the edge of dreams. The fog thickened slightly, as if tucking them in. Morning arrived, not with a bang, nor with a songbird's jubilant warble, but with a light sneeze. A single, polite HU echoed across the mossy hilltop. Then silence. Leaf blinked awake to see a pinnacone resting on his forehead. He brushed it away and sat up slowly. Around him, his crew remained scattered like forgotten laundry. One Viking, snoring into a helmet. Another curled under a blanket of ferns, and Bjorn suspiciously missing again. The fire had burned itself down to a smolder, and a light mist swirled over the camp like an indecisive fog. Unsure whether to lift or linger, Leaf stretched. His back cracked. Somewhere in the trees, something sighed, probably a breeze, possibly a philosophical raccoon. It was time to resume their expedition. "Bjorn," Leaf called softly, trying not to disturb anyone who hadn't yet given up on their dreams. A rustle from behind a berry bush answered. Bjorn emerged, holding a long stick balanced across his shoulders, upon which hung a pair of socks, gray, slightly fuzzy, and very definitely Leaf's. "I found them," Bjorn said proudly. "They were drying on a rock by the creek." Leaf squinted at him. "And you're sure they weren't yours?" "They're yours. Mine smell like old cheese. These smell like mystery and campfire." "Fair enough." He gratefully accepted the socks and wiggled them back onto his feet. It was like reuniting with two long-lost foot friends. Warmth spread from his toes to his chest. There is a special kind of peace only reunited socks can bring. "So," Bjorn said, "what's the plan?" Leaf pondered this. The original plan had been explore whatever land this is. But now, things felt different. The forest didn't seem in a hurry to reveal itself, and frankly, neither did the Vikings. Let's walk a bit, see what we find, slowly. They assembled a new scouting party, if by assembled you mean nudged, sleeping Vikings with sticks, until they got up and agreed to meander. Within the hour, they were wandering in loosely coordinated directions through the trees, humming half-remembered drinking songs and occasionally stopping to smell bark. The fog shifted as they moved, partying like polite curtains. Ferns gave way to clearings, and beneath the canopy, curious sounds drifted, gurgling brooks, distant giggles, maybe the faint humming of a bear doing laundry. No one could be sure. Then they found the moose. It was just standing there, chewing something green and leafy, blinking at them in a way that suggested it had no urgent appointments. "Oh," Leaf said, "you're majestic." The moose blinked again, utterly unbothered by their presence. Bjorn took a cautious step forward. "Is this ... the leader of the forest?" The moose chewed thoughtfully, then turned and began walking. Not fast, not dramatically, just ... forward. The Vikings looked at each other. Then, with mutual shrugs, they followed. You don't not follow a moose that appears in your story. It's basic narrative etiquette. The moose led them deeper into the woods, along a path none of them could have found alone. Trees arched overhead like sleepy cathedral ceilings. The ground grew even softer, so much so that their footsteps made no sound. Occasionally, the moose would pause to nibble on something, or to stare dreamily into the distance, like it had forgotten what it was doing. Leaf found himself walking slower, breathing easier. The usual tension of leadership had faded. Here, in this dreamlike land of socks and stew, he didn't feel the weight of expectations. Eventually, the moose stopped beside a stream and lowered its head to drink. The Vikings stopped, too, settling into the moss without needing to be told. "This is weirdly soothing," said Olaf, lying flat on his back. "I think this moose might be a kind of forest tour guide," Bjorn whispered. "Do we tip it?" asked Ingrid, seriously. They watched the moose for several minutes, which in forest time is about 3 naps. Then, with a content snort, it turned and continued walking, and again they followed. The trail led to a glade where sunlight filtered. Through tall birch trees in delicate ribbons, butterflies drifted lazily, performing aerial ballet with absolutely no urgency. The moose stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat down, legs folding under it like a strange, fuzzy cushion. The Vikings stood awkwardly around for a moment before deciding this must be a scheduled break. Leaf sat next to the moose, who didn't seem to mind. "This doesn't feel like a place we conquer," he murmured to himself. "Feels more like a place that lets you stay, if you're quiet enough." The moose gave him a look that could have meant anything, but probably meant exactly. Bjorn plopped down beside him and offered the moose a berry. It declined with what Leaf could only describe as a sigh of ancient wisdom. A squirrel darted past, then paused, then slowly backed up and sat beside the moose, as if also attending the meeting. More squirrels arrived, then a rabbit, then something that might have been a very round fox, or possibly an unusually furry pillow with eyes. Soon, the clearing felt like a storybook waiting to be written. Leaf smiled. The sock mystery, it seemed, had led them not just to new land, but to a land that required nothing from them but stillness. No maps, no battles, no declarations, just ... being. "Sockland," he whispered. The moose nodded, and then sneezed again. It was decided unanimously, though no vote was held, that they would stay in the glade for a while. No one used the word settle, because that sounded far too official, and besides, it implied they were done moving. No, they weren't settling. They were pausing with intention. The glade had that effect on people. It was as if the place existed just outside of time's usual demands. There was no rush here, no sense that the sun had somewhere better to be. It glowed gently above, spilling dappled warmth across the mossy floor like a particularly generous blanket. The moose remained. So did the squirrel, who had now claimed a flat rock as its throne and was currently munching something orange with tremendous concentration. "I'm beginning to think this glade might have rules," Bjorn whispered, poking the moss beside him. "Like ... unspoken, moss-based laws." "What, like no yelling?" Olaf asked, chewing on a stick of smoked fish. "No yelling, no maps, and socks must remain on at all times," Bjorn said solemnly, glancing at Leif's feet. Leif lifted one foot. The sock remained. "Understood," he nodded. For the rest of the day, the crew leaned into the rhythm of the glade. Weapons were stowed, helmets used as bowls. One man turned a small fallen log into a lounge chair by leaning against it dramatically and claiming he was conducting philosophical experiments in posture. Ingrid set up a makeshift apothecary under a birch tree and began labeling leaves with suspicious confidence. "This one is good for dreams. This one repels grumpiness. This one probably makes soup more interesting." The hours passed in that soft, wandering way that makes one question whether they ever passed at all. Afternoon blended with early evening, the sun shifting like a drowsy cat turning over in its sleep. Leif sat beside the stream, letting the cold water run over his hands. It whispered over smooth stones and vanished beneath a bed of moss downstream, heading somewhere no map could track. "This place," he said aloud, "feels like a yawn stretched into a forest." The moose, reclining nearby with its chin resting on a rock, blinked once. Approval, probably. Bjorn wandered over and dropped a small, lumpy item beside him. "I made a muffin." Leif inspected it. "That's a rock." Bjorn shrugged. "A muffin of the land." Then, and indeed, it did have a certain rustic charm, as twilight curled around them like a sleepy cat. The fire was lit again, not too big, not too bright, just enough to hum and flicker, sending little shadows dancing across the glade. They gathered close, but not too close. Personal space, after all, was the true luxury of a thoughtful evening. Leif stood, stretching. I think this might be the first time I've explored a place and didn't feel like I had to claim it." Ingrid looked up. "You have claimed something? Peace, and perhaps an unreasonable number of cloudberries." "I didn't claim peace," he said, thoughtfully. "It just came when I stopped reaching. Sounds like the berries are working." Bjorn nodded. They laughed softly, because in the glade, even laughter felt like it should tiptoe. Later, they told stories. Not grand ones, but silly, winding tales about cooking disasters, near-miss beard fires, and the time Olaf accidentally tried to ride a goat thinking it was a very squat horse. The stars blinked into place above them slowly, like each one was deciding whether it felt like being part of the sky tonight. And then, little by little, the fire died down. Leif rolled onto his back, the moss beneath him so soft it may as well have been memory foam carved by angels. "Tomorrow?" he asked the sky. "Maybe," the wind answered. "Or it might have been." The moose dot before sleep came. Leif reached down and touched his socks one last time, just to be sure. Still there. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that simple fact made everything feel just right. Far away, an owl hooted, or maybe snored. The squirrel, still awake, began reorganizing pebbles. The glade exhaled, and the Vikings, warriors of wind and sea, dreamt of nothing. Morning arrived with the kind of gentle light that makes the world look like it's been dusted with sugar. Not bright, not sharp, just a soft glow that seemed to stretch and yawn along with the waking forest. Leaf opened his eyes slowly, feeling the moss beneath him like a gentle embrace. His socks, once again, were warm and cozy, reliable companions on this odd adventure. The camp stirred quietly. Olaf was already brewing some oddly fragrant tea that smelled like pine and cinnamon, had a slow conversation in a cozy cabin. Bjorn was still half asleep, but managed a toothy grin when he saw Leaf. Ingrid was busy gathering fresh herbs, humming a tune that sounded like a lullaby borrowed from the wind. "Good morning," Leaf said, sitting up. "How does the glade greet us today?" "With calmness and a touch of squirrel mischief," Ingrid replied, waving a sprig of something green. They ate breakfast, slowly, whatever Olaf concocted, served with cloudberries and a side of goodnate, grumbling about Viking cuisine standards. Once the meal settled, Leaf stood and stretched. "Today, we explore the river that sings." Bjorn raised an eyebrow. "Sings?" Leaf nodded. "That's what the forest feels like it has a song hidden beneath the water." With that, they packed light, moving through the glade toward a soft, melodic trickle that grew steadily into a river's gentle hum. The path followed the river's curve, leading them past wildflowers that nodded sleepily and birds that flitted in lazy arcs. The air smelled of fresh water and earth, and the gentle sound of flowing river became a constant companion, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a lullaby. They walked without hurry, letting the world unfold at its own pace. Bjorn tried skipping stones, but failed spectacularly, each stone plopping with a plunk rather than a graceful skip. Leaf laughed softly. "Practice makes progress, friend." Soon, they arrived at a bend where the river widened into a calm pool, its surface smooth as glass and reflecting the sky's pale blue. Here, the Vikings paused. Some dipped their hands into the cool water, watching as ripples stretched outward in perfect circles. Ingrid knelt by the water's edge, plucking a handful of smooth pebbles. "These stones carry stories," she said softly, "each one worn by time and water's gentle song." Leaf picked up a pebble, turning it over in his hand. It was cool, smooth, and felt strangely alive, like holding a tiny piece of the glade's quiet magic. The group settled near the water, sharing gentle conversation and the occasional quiet moment where words weren't needed. Leaf felt the peacefulness settle deep in his bones, a calm that made the world seem less urgent, more like a slowly turning page in a book that didn't need to be rushed. As the afternoon slipped toward evening, the sun softened, casting long shadows that danced lightly on the water's surface. Bjorn, who had been watching a group of dragonflies skim the river, finally spoke. "Do you think the sock led us here for a reason?" Leaf smiled thoughtfully. Maybe it wasn't the sock at all, but the journey it started. Olaf nodded. "A journey of finding quiet corners in a noisy world." Ingrid added, "And maybe learning to listen to the river, the trees, and ourselves." The group sat quietly as the sky dimmed, wrapped in the gentle sounds of the glade's evening song. Leaf leaned back on his hands, eyes half closed. The river's music mingled with the soft hoots of owls and the rustle of leaves, creating a lullaby only the forest could compose. He thought of the sock, the moose, the mossy gladden, realized that sometimes the most unexpected adventures were the ones that helped you find a little peace. As night deepened, the Vikings prepared to rest, the gentle rhythm of the river still humming in their dreams, and in the heart of the glade, wrapped in warmth and quiet, Leaf finally let himself sink fully into sleep. Dawn's first light trickled softly through the birch branches, casting delicate patterns that danced slowly on the moss below. The glade stirred gently, as if waking from a long, contented sigh. Leaf opened his eyes, feeling the comforting weight of his socks hugging his feet like old friends. The river's quiet song was still in the air, mingling with the fresh scent of dew-kissed leaves around him. His companions stretched and yawned, smiles soft and eyes bright with the kind of peacefulness only found in places untouched by haste. Today's plan was simple: follow the river downstream and see where it would lead them. They moved slowly, savoring every step, every breath of the cool, fragrant air. Birds called quietly overhead, their songs gentle and unhurried, as if they too were mindful not to disturb the glade's calm. The river widened, its surface shimmering like a silver ribbon unfurling through the forest. Dragonflies darted gracefully above the water, their iridescent wings catching the light like tiny stained glass windows. Leaf paused to watch a particularly bold one hover close, its delicate body reflecting the sun in a tiny dance of colors. He smiled softly, feeling a quiet connection to this small marvel. Bjorn attempted to mimic the dragonfly's flight with exaggerated arm movements, causing a ripple of chuckles among the group. As they walked, the forest opened to reveal an ancient stone bridge arching gracefully over the river. Moss-covered and worn by time, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. The Vikings crossed carefully, the soft crunch of their footsteps mingling with the river's gentle murmur. On the other side, the trees grew taller, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. Here, the air held a different kind of magic odor, deeper. The glade's peacefulness had transformed into a quiet reverence. Leaf felt the weight of centuries beneath his feet, the stories whispered by the stones and the wind. Ingrid bent to examine a cluster of wildflowers blooming at the bridge's edge, their petals delicate and glowing faintly in the filtered light. "They say these flowers only bloom where kindness has been," she murmured, gently touching a blossom. Leaf considered this, thinking of the kindness shared in this glade between friends, between stranger and forest. They continued along the riverbank, the path winding through tall grasses and shaded hollows. Suddenly, Olaf stopped and pointed excitedly. "Look, a fish jumping." A silver flash arced above the water, ripples sparkling in its wake. Bjorn laughed. "That fish has better timing than I do." Leaf chuckled, the sound soft and warm. "Maybe it's here to remind us to enjoy the small moments." As afternoon softened into evening, the group settled near a quiet bend in the river. They shared stories, laughter light and easy, like feathers floating on a breeze. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold. Leaf leaned back against a tree, the cool bark steady and reassuring behind him. The river's song played on, steady and soothing, wrapping around them like a gentle blanket. As night fell, the stars began to twinkle, each one a tiny beacon in the velvet sky. Leaf felt a deep sense of gratitude for the river, the forest, the socks that started it all, and the friends who shared this journey. He closed his eyes, the river's lullaby guiding him toward peaceful dreams. The night settled over the glade like a soft, dark quilt, stitched with shimmering stars that blinked sleepily above. The gentle sounds of the forest lulled the Vikings deeper into calma chorus of rustling leaves, distant owl calls, and the steady whisper of the river nearby. Leaf lay back on the mossy floor, feeling the earth's slow heartbeat beneath him. His socks, still warm and snug, seemed to pulse in time with the glade's quiet rhythm around him. His friends settled into restful positions, their breathing slow and even. Bjorn's beard twitched slightly as he dreamed of muffin-shaped rocks. Olaf's peaceful smile hinted at a dream where goats politely waited for their riders. Ingrid hummed softly, the melody mingling with the night air like a lullaby from the trees themselves. The glade breathed with them, its presence a comforting embrace that blurred the edges of the world until all that remained was this moment of perfect stillness. Leif's thoughts grew soft and slow, drifting like leaves on a gentle stream. The day's adventures folded neatly into memory, each one a quiet treasure tucked away beneath the mossy floor. The socks felt like a small talisman of calm, a reminder that sometimes the smallest things lead to the greatest discoveries. Outside, the stars traced lazy patterns across the sky, their light dimming softly as the forest sank deeper into sleep. Leif's breath slowed, each exhale a soft whisper in the cool night air. The moose, ever watchful, settled nearby with a contented sigh, its presence steady and reassuring. The river's lullaby continued, a gentle song that seemed to wrap the whole glade in a soothing embrace. And as the darkness deepened, the world grew quiet, softening around the edges like a fading dream. Leif's last thoughts drifted on a breeze, light and free, thankful for the journey, for the glade, for the unexpected magic of a lost sock. Sleep came gently then, a slow and peaceful tide carrying him into dreams woven with moss and river songs, quiet laughter, and the warm glow of friendship. The glade held them all in its tender care, a secret place where time paused and the world whispered, "All is well." Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. Good night.